Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chaf, Volume 20, the second Sicha for Parshas Mikeitz. This Sicha will explain the uniqueness of the observance of Shabbos of Yosef HaTzadik and how it connects to our times, meaning how it applies realistically to our observance of Shabbos, namely the effect that our observance of Shabbos has in the world or on the world. As a quick introduction to familiarize us with some of the concepts that will be discussed in the Sicha. So first of all, we know that in every mitzvah, there are always two aspects of the observance of the mitzvah. There is what we call the gavra, which literally means the individual, the person, and then the chefza, the object of the mitzvah. You have mitzvahs that sometimes are more primarily focused on the gavra, on the person who's observing the mitzvahs and his transformation. And then there is where the mitzvah affects the chefza, the object itself. Just as a very quick and obvious example, when one does the mitzvah, for example, of writing a pair of tefillin, the chefza, the object itself, now becomes permeated with the holiness and it transforms into a holy object. It now needs to be treated as such. But you have some mitzvahs where it's just the gavra, the person who's observing the mitzvahs, who becomes affected by the mitzvah. Another thing to be familiar with, in the Aseres HaDibros, in the Ten Commandments, when Hashem commands us about the observance of Shabbos, it says, in one place, it says, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos, you should remember the day of Shabbos to make it holy, while in the other time that the Ten Commandments are mentioned in the Torah, it says, Shamar es Yom HaShabbos, you should safeguard, you should keep the day of Shabbos to make it holy. So we know that they're both equal. Just like you have to make sure to keep the Shabbos and not to desecrate it, so we know too that we must remember the day of Shabbos. Some of the examples of what we do to quote-unquote remember the day of Shabbos to make it holy is not only, for example, making the Kiddush in the beginning of Shabbos and the Havdalah at the end of Shabbos, but also the preparations we do for Shabbos. We do it to prepare ourselves for Shabbos, and the preparation itself, as we'll see in the Sicha, becomes somewhat of a observance of Shabbos itself. Another thing to be familiar with, we know that all the Avos, the patriarchs, and likewise their descendants, the Shvatim, they observed the entire Torah even before it was given. Meaning before Hashem formally gave us the mitzvahs, they were already privy to it and they observed all the mitzvahs. One last thing, we know that what was affected by Matan Torah, what exactly was accomplished with Hashem giving us the Torah, if, based on what I just said, we know that many were privy to it already. Am Yisrael already had an idea of the Torah. So what then changed? There was nothing new, or so it would seem. Well, the answer is, we know, as the Medrash says, that prior to Matan Torah, there was a gzera, there was a decree. Or also the word gzera means, constantly etymology, it means there was a split, there was a divide between the Elyonim, which you can say basically is the spiritual realm, and the Tachtonim, the lower realm, the world. And they didn't mix. They couldn't mix. However, when Hashem came down on Mount Sinai and gave us the Torah formally, now He removed that split, He removed that divide, He removed that decree, and now, not only we could, but we must connect the two by virtue of the performance of the mitzvahs. Let's get into the Sicha. So when the brothers of Yosef came the second time to see him, they were invited to Yosef's house. Yosef said to the person who was appointed on his home, if you looked in chapter 43, verse 16, he says, he said to the person who's in charge of his house, prepare this meal. He says, you should go and slaughter the animals that are necessary for the meals, and v'hochein, and you should prepare. So the sages tell us in the Medrash that the word v'hochein is a euphemism for Shabbos. In other words, when it says, and you should prepare, this has a unique connection to Shabbos. How so? Because much later in the book of Shmos, the book of Exodus, in Parshas Bishalach, where the Torah tells us the story of how Bnei Yisrael received the man from heaven, there it says, V'hoya bayoyim hashishi, it shall be on the sixth day, meaning on Friday, v'hachinu es asher, and they shall prepare. So we see the word preparing in association with preparing for Shabbos. Says the Medrash, from here you can see explicitly that Yosef HaTzadik kept the Shabbos. Now it's understood and obvious that the Medrash is not out to tell us that only Yosef observed the Shabbos. Because as we mentioned already in the introduction, it's a fact that all the Avos and also their descendants, the Shvatim, all observed all the mitzvahs. All the mitzvahs, of course, would include the most important and primary mitzvahs, for example, Shabbos. So, what exactly is this telling us? Well, what it's telling us is that although they all observe the Torah mitzvahs, but the mitzvah of Shabbos is explicitly written in association with Yosef. What does this mean? That this points out the idea that Yosef's observance of Shabbos was unique, even compared to all his brothers and to his ancestors, who also kept the Shabbos, certainly. As we said, they kept all the mitzvahs, but that Yosef stood out. There's something unique about it. There's something exclusive about it. The question is, what is it about the observance of Shabbos of Yosef that makes it so unique, makes it so exclusive? Another thing we need to understand, if you look closely, how is Yosef's Shabbos observance being presented? It seems to be in a roundabout manner. It's not saying directly he observed Shabbos, but it's saying is that since he prepared the food before Shabbos, it's obvious that he didn't prepare the food on Shabbos. He would not have the person in charge of his home prepare the food on Shabbos. And since he explicitly told him to prepare it before Shabbos, this is proof that he prepared before Shabbos, so he didn't work on Shabbos, he only worked on Friday. Why couldn't it have just been in a more direct manner? In other words, why couldn't the emphasis be, since he told him to prepare for Shabbos, which, by the way, as we'll see later, this is the halacha, that when you prepare for Shabbos, when you're making the meals for Shabbos, you're actually, in a sense, observing Shabbos. As we said, you are fulfilling, you're accomplishing that mitzvah of Zocher, remembering the day of Shabbos. But this is more direct. So why did the Medrash present it in a manner of, since he didn't prepare on Shabbos, and he prepared before, so it's proof that he didn't work on Shabbos, so here you have proof that he kept Shabbos. So the Rebbe says, we'll understand all of this and appreciate it by first prefacing an explanation, a deeper clarification in the words that the Medrash says. The Medrash says that Yosef HaTzadik kept the Shabbos even before it was given, meaning before it was formally given to us on Har Sinai. Now, the question is, why does the Medrash even bother to mention this? It would seem obvious. Saying that Yosef HaTzadik observed Shabbos, everybody knows that the Torah had not yet been given. We haven't yet reached Parshas Yisro, where it describes the giving of the Torah. The Jews have not even been in Egypt yet. So it's obvious. So why would the Medrash make this emphasis of saying even before it was given? Says the Rebbe, the answer lies in the word given. You see, when does the word given apply? Meaning it was or was not yet given. The fact that you are saying it was or wasn't given already implies that it exists, that the thing is in existence. You see, because something that doesn't exist, it's not a matter of it having been given to you or not, that you have access to it or not. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. This is what the Medrash is emphasizing, that Yosef HaTzadik observed Shabbos even before it was given. What does that mean? That the concept of Shabbos, the idea of Shabbos, already existed. It's here in existence. It's just that it wasn't yet formally given. What does this mean? You see, one of the reasons that the Torah gives in the Aseret HaDibros, in the Ten Commandments, for why we must observe Shabbos, it says, that for 6 days Hashem made the heavens and the earth, and He rested on the seventh day. As it says, He rested and He had total rest. He ceased from work and He had total rest. From this we understand that immediately at the end of the 6 days of creation, immediately the idea, the concept, the existence of Shabbos was already there in the world. And as He already says in Chumash Bereshis, right in the beginning, Right there in the beginning, it says, "Vayechulu hashamayim v'aretz," that now Hashem completed the heavens and the earth. Vayechal elikim Hashem. Hashem ceased from working. Vayishbais, and He rested. So the idea of Shabbos already existed. It's just that the actual commandment to Bnei Yisrael, meaning the formal commandment that they need to observe the Shabbos, was quote unquote not yet given, not yet delivered. Now we'll appreciate why Shabbos is different than all the other mitzvahs. Shabbos is very unique compared to all the other mitzvahs. You see, all the mitzvahs that were given to us after Matan Torah, indeed, did not exist until Matan Torah. In other words, in Matan Torah, they came to be. They came into existence. Whereas the mitzvah of Shabbos, as we just made the point, already existed. It's just that it wasn't yet given. And therefore, when they observed those mitzvahs, meaning the Avos and the Shvatim, where they observed the mitzvahs, they did not have the cheftza of the mitzvah. They didn't have the object of the mitzvah. Why? There was no effect in the world because it didn't exist in the world. It wasn't in this realm. It wasn't here. And they didn't have the power to make it happen. It's just that the person who observed the mitzvah, in this case, the Avos and the Shvatim, this affected their gavra. This elevated them spiritually, the person who observed the mitzvah, but the mitzvah itself had no effect in the world. But Shabbos, however, because it already exists in the world, therefore, there was perhaps some possibility of actually having the effect of Shabbos in the world, albeit in time, not in space, but in time. And now we have clarity in this expression of what the Medrash says before it was given. The idea of Shabbos, meaning to rest from work, to cease from work, and to rest, already existed before. And therefore, when it was given by Sinai, when the Torah was given, so the idea, the concept of Shabbos remained the same concept. It's just that now it was released to our access. That until then, it was in the realm of the Creator, so to speak. We didn't have access to it. And now, meaning we didn't have the power, the ability to connect it, to fuse it, our resting with our existence in the world. And now that Hashem gave the Torah, now we have access to it. Now we have the power, where it's in our reach, to bring down the Shabbos into the world. When Hashem came down on Har Sinai and He gave us the Torah, right? He gave us access to this. The object of Shabbos that was only available to Hashem, so to speak, and the person down here didn't have access to it, now it became accessible. Hashem gave it to us. Now we can really appreciate the contrast or the uniqueness of the Shmira Shabbos of Yosef versus his brothers and the Avos. You see, when the Avos and his brothers, the Shvatim, when they observed their mitzvahs, as we said before, including the mitzvah of Shabbos, they did not have the ability to affect the object, to affect the world. And, for example, Avrohom Avinu didn't have tefillin, Yaakov Avinu didn't have a talis, they didn't have a Sefer Torah, because they didn't have effect, and including Shabbos. They didn't have the power to transform the object of the world, meaning the material of the world, whether time or space, into something holy. They just couldn't do it. However, Yosef, the fact that the Torah mentions explicitly that he kept Shabbos, the fact that the Torah tells us that he said v'hachen, and the Medrash tells us what this means. It means that he kept Shabbos. This tells us that at least in the aspect of Shabbos, Yosef HaTzadik did have that power. He did have that ability to actually connect it. It was to bring it down into reality, into the Metzius of the world. Why is this really so? In other words, why this difference, this contrast between the Avos and the Shvatim? The answer is because we also see it inherently in their approach, in their style of avodah. You see, we know that Yosef, this is the reason, by the way, why he's called Yosef HaTzadik, even though they were all tzaddikim, versus his brothers, had a totally different approach in how to do the avodah in the world. The approach of the Shvatim, and likewise the Avos, was, and that's what we find, that they were primarily Royei tzayin, there were shepherds of sheep. And as the Kli Yakar says, being a shepherd, being out there in a very, very rural area, and there's hardly any people there, or none at all, and you're just there with the sheep, which requires very little work, this actually triggers his boidedus. You kind of separate, you're with yourself, you're able to meditate, you're able to reflect, you're able to daven, you're able to do things, but you're totally removed from the world, isolated from the world. And therefore, their actions were also in such a mode. It was more in the spiritual realm, but it was removed from the world. They could not affect the world. And therefore, even when it came to Shabbos, which as we said, already does exist somewhat in the world, they didn't have the power to bring Shabbos and plug it in with the world and connect it with the world. In other words, their Shabbos, their resting, didn't affect time, the time of the world, and certainly not the space of the world. However, Yosef, what was Yosef's mode of avodah? Yosef ended up in Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was the lowliest place of the world. He didn't just exist there, but rather he was integrated and involved in all the matters there, to the extent that he was the ruler. He wasn't just the ruler on a lofty level, but down to the lowest level. As we've seen in the expression that Pare says to him, what does Pare say? That you will govern. A person won't even have permission to lift their hand or their foot. The foot represents the lowliest part of the person, the lowliest realm, the lowliest level. Even that, Yosef had total control over. And then we see further, he was the one who fed all of Egypt. In other words, they were totally dependent on him in a materialistic manner. And in a spiritual manner, he was also in total control over them. He was the one who told them that they all need to make a bris milah. Since he was down here, even when he was down here in the world, involved in Mitzrayim, what does it say? Vayehi Hashem es Yosef. That Hashem was with Yosef. In other words, he didn't have to remove himself from the world to be with Hashem, and that Hashem should be with him. But even, or maybe especially because he was involved in the world, because of his style of avodah, Hashem was him there. In other words, what does that mean? He had the power to inject godliness even into worldly manners. Okay? Similar to what we have, what was given to us post Matan Torah. And therefore, now we can appreciate why his Shabbos, his observance of Shabbos, did have an effect in the world, at least to the extent that it had an effect on the Zman, on the aspect of time in the world, that it became a day of holiness, and he prepared before. And now we can appreciate and answer the question we asked in the beginning, how come the Torah brings out this idea, expresses this idea that Yosef kept Shabbos through the means of telling us that he prepared in advance, kind of an indirect manner? The answer is, this idea of preparing, the hachin, this brings out the greatness and the extent of the observance of Shabbos. You see, the fact that a person doesn't work on Shabbos, in other words, a person is just resting, that in itself doesn't yet mean that the world was transformed, the world around the person, or the person's worldly matter. Why? Because all it means is that the Gavra, the person, is not working. However, when you prepare food for Shabbos, you prepare your house for Shabbos, and you're doing it before Shabbos, and only because you did it before Shabbos, now you're able to eat and to enjoy Shabbos, this affects that also the objects of the world, and even the Zman, the time of Friday, should become elevated, should become transformed to the idea of Shabbos. In other words, it affects the cheftza of the world, that it becomes Shabbosdik, it becomes important, it becomes elevated. And this is really the true depth of the idea, the concept of v'achinu, that, you should prepare for Shabbos. Because really, meaning what it says over there in Parshas V'Shalach, because really if you look at it, it doesn't make sense. Because it doesn't just say they should prepare for Shabbos. First it says whatever needs to be baked should be baked. Whatever needs to be cooked should be cooked. So already speaks about the preparation. So what then does it add with the word v'achinu? So we know the Gemara tells us, and this is halacha, that it's not enough to just cook and bake for Shabbos. In other words, happen to prepare food, which you're going to happen to eat on Shabbos. But rather, it has to be done in a manner of v'hachinu, and you should prepare it. Meaning, you have to explicitly designate it for Shabbos. And that's why many have the custom to actually say, this is being made, l'kavod Shabbos Kodesh. That this is for Shabbos. What does the v'hachinu do? That the preparing it, not just happen to be making it on Friday because you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos, but making it for Shabbos, what it does is, it takes this food that you're preparing for this meal, and it becomes a Shabbos-dik meal. It already becomes a Shabbos-dik, it becomes a Suda Shabbos even before Shabbos began. And therefore the Torah hints to us, the Torah reveals to us the observance of Shabbos of Yosef HaTzadik in this word v'hachim, because there's a parallel. What did Yosef do? Yosef transformed the day of Shabbos, not just spiritually, but as we said, also the chefts of the day. He did have the power, unlike the other Shvatim had. He was able to transform something that wasn't yet available to be transformed or wasn't accessible for all, and he was able to take that and turn it into Shabbos. And likewise, what we are able to do. Our v'hachinu, we take food that happens to be cooked on Friday and we turn it into a Seudah Shabbos. We make it into something holy, something lofty. This idea, says the Rebbe, that there are two levels in the two manners in the observance of Shabbos, has also a parallel in our times. Even though we already received the Torah and we're already able to transform the world with our observance of Shabbos, as we just explained. You see, there is the aspect of Shabbos which we are explicitly and directly, meaning overtly, commanded to do. The things that you're not allowed to do, the things that you're allowed to do, the things that you must do. All these things that are written in halacha, the do's and the don'ts of Shabbos, this is one aspect of Shabbos. But then there is a deeper aspect of Shabbos, which is available to us, but we need to do our part to access that. And that is, it's brought down that when a person observes Shabbos at a much higher level, and this is parallel to Yosef HaTzadik, they're able to actually accomplish, in other words, they're able to bring down a much higher aspect of Shabbos. What is that higher level of observance? So it says on Shabbos, one should actually refrain from any mundane talk. Why? What is the idea of it? Just like Hashem ceased from saying the utterances, in other words, talking, so to speak. And that was his observance of Shabbos. So likewise, a human, a Yid, should also endeavor to refrain from talking anything that is not directly connected to Shabbos and to holiness, to Torah and learning and so on, and davening, and to do Shabbos. And this is parallel to Yosef. Because just like before Matan Torah, his Shabbos did have an effect. In other words, it's appreciated as it had an effect. And why did he do it? In other words, what compelled him to do it? What was the power that he was drawing? He wasn't drawing power that was available to the human being, because it wasn't available. But what was he drawing from? In other words, where did he get the ability to do it? He was drawing directly from Hashem, so to speak. Likewise, when a human being connects to Hashem on a higher level on Shabbos, and goes the extra step of not talking on Shabbos because Hashem didn't talk on Shabbos, now that is parallel, that is similar to what Yosef HaTzadik accomplished, and we have the ability for that to affect our reality. And the Rebbe concludes, which obviously keeping Shabbos on a much higher level will most certainly lead us even quicker to the Geula, because we know the sages tell us that if the Yidden would only keep 2 Shabbosos, and it's explained in Chassidus, 2 Shabbosos doesn't mean 2 separate Shabbosos, it means one complete whole Shabbos, then certainly miyad nig'olim, they would be redeemed immediately.